thank you all for joining us as usual. Per our normal thing, the reason we're doing these calls is to be educational, engaging, and to give volunteers an easy, low barrier opportunity to get involved and contact their local politicians. And that's what we're going to be doing at the end of this call. And we have a series of things you can do, all related to raising more money, more taxes on the wealthy, so that we can pay for a lot of the progressive things we all care about. And then we'll also be hopping on the phones as well to call our representatives to leave a message to the same end. A quick no honeymoon update, because this is the no honeymoon campaign. This is going to be our last weekly call. We've been doing these every week now for 100 days or so. This is going to be the last weekly call, and then we're going to be switching to more monthly things so we can build them. We can have bigger events with more time to prepare and get more people in here. But thank you all for joining us tonight. I always have a lot of fun here. So without further ado, we're going to be talking to Jeff Cohen and Phyllis Bennis this evening. Jeff Cohen will be focusing on domestic policy. Phyllis Bennis will be focusing on foreign policy. And we're going to be reviewing Biden's first 100 days. If you have questions, thoughts, concerns, top issues you want to chat about, be sure to add those to the chat now, and we will bring them up during our conversation as best we can. If you don't know them, which you probably do, Jeff Cohen is co-founder of rootsaction.org. He's a media critic, columnist, documentary filmmaker, retired journalism professor who founded the media watch group FAIR in 1986. He used to be a regular pundit on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, discussing issues of media and politics. He is the author of Cable News Confidential, My Misadventures in Corporate Media. So thank you very much, Jeff, for being here with us. And we are also joined by Phyllis Bennis, who directs the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, U.S. wars, and UN issues. She is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. In 2001, she helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and now serves on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. She's written and edited 11 books. Among her latest is the 7th updated edition of her popular Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. Thank you, Phyllis, for being here as well.
Great to be with you all.
Excellent. So first question I want to ask is to both of you. We'll start with you, Jeff. Biden's cabinet so far. We know that personnel is policy so often. What are your thoughts on the domestic side for Joe Biden's cabinet so far? What grade do you give him, I guess, or what are your thoughts? Is it a mixed bag?
Oh, it's definitely a mixed bag. And I want to thank the activists on this call who've done a lot of work even before Biden took office, trying to influence who was appointed to the cabinet and who wasn't. Activism has really mattered. I think about the Department of Energy, Secretary of Energy. There was talk at the beginning that Biden was going to choose Ernest Moniz, the same Secretary of Energy that Obama had. And Moniz is tied to the nuclear industry, oil and gas. And there were groups like Greenpeace and other groups that raised holy hell. And as a result, the Secretary of Energy now is not Ernest Moniz. Biden appointed Jennifer Granholm, the former governor of Michigan, who was on record supporting the Standing Rock protesters. She's commented about how we have to leave fossil fuel in the ground, something you don't generally have not heard in the past from secretaries of energy. So I want to talk about the activism that has made things better than they would have been. I saw Medea Benjamin on this call. I mean, groups like Code Pink and Roots Action, we were yelling and screaming about Michelle Flournoy, the ideological war hawk, who was at the top of the list, according to every report, to be the Secretary of Defense. And they never appointed her. Instead, we got General Lloyd Austin. He's not great. He was on the board of Raytheon, but he's not an ideological militarist like Flournoy. And there were a few peace groups and Roots Action and Code Pink and a few others, World Beyond War, and then some good reporting in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about Flournoy, and Biden appointed someone else. So activism always matters, even if we're just a small percentage of the reason something happened. Activism matters. So yeah, it's been a mixed bag, but it would have been worse if it wasn't for progressive activism.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, one of the big struggles we were in for about a month was making sure Neera Tanden was not appointed, and she ultimately was not, and that's
and to this right. And to this day, Rahm Emanuel still has not been appointed. But I could lead into Phyllis. There's a really important report put out by the Revolving Door Project. I think it came out in the last week or so. And it's about capture, how corporations tend to capture every new administration. So they gave grades on whether the Biden administration had kept certain industries out of the executive branch. And on keeping Wall Street out, this report pointed out how much better Biden has been on warding off Wall Street than Obama. I mean, the economic team for Obama were basically Wall Streeters. So they got a B on that, a BB plus. On keeping big tech out of the executive branch, they got a B. The Biden team on keeping oil and gas out of their environmental team, they got a B. On keeping the military industrial complex out of the executive branch, they got a D minus. And maybe that's a good time to turn it over to Phyllis.
Yeah, so Phyllis.
This question of,
Go ahead.
Sorry, I thought I was still muted. No, this question of who's in the cabinet is absolutely crucial. And I think, one of the biggest successes that we saw of movement activism was the appointment of Deb Haaland, the new Secretary of the Interior, the first Native American woman in the cabinet. And she's a longtime supporter of Native rights, an opponent of big oil and gas. She's not an activist out of Greenpeace. She's not going to call for keeping the oil in the soil and the gas in the ground. She's a pragmatist, but she comes out of a Native community that sees what the danger has been of uranium mining, of oil and gas throughout New Mexico. New Mexico is the second poorest state in the country, and its three biggest industries are the military, particularly involving nuclear weapons technology, private prisons. And, this is the kind of reality that we see in the most impoverished components of our country. So having somebody from New Mexico, having a Native American woman as the Secretary of the Interior, who is, of course, in charge of native lands, is a huge issue. And I think it's a very important statement about the power of movements. The environmental justice movement has been one of the most successful in forcing changes of various sorts within the new Biden administration. On the question of foreign policy, we heard from Jeff already about the Secretary of Defense. And then, of course, we have the Secretary of State, somebody who is Antony Blinken, who is very much a reflection of, I would say, of what Biden intends on foreign policy, which is to say that foreign policy is not, and for quite some time is not going to be, a major priority of his administration. They've been very clear about that. This administration came in with a priority set around dealing with the pandemic and dealing with the economic crisis that resulted from the pandemic. Both of those absolutely appropriate. It's not necessarily wrong. But the United States is still the most powerful country in the entire world. And so to say that somehow we're going to put aside the question of foreign policy just means that either things remain the same, or there is a set of quick decisions that are not grounded in serious consideration of what a new policy might look like. And the tendency to go back to the assumptions of war are very much there. We're seeing that around Iran, which, other than the escalation of rhetoric so far and actions against China, the return to the Iran nuclear deal, I think, is the one area of foreign policy, which we'll be talking about later, that is part of the priority for the Biden administration. It was it was probably Obama's biggest foreign policy success, and Biden certainly wants to claim his role within that. He was a supporter of it within the administration. Many were not. But dealing with Antony Blinken, who was not quite as enthusiastic about that deal as Biden himself. It doesn't mean he's one of the ones who are trying to scuttle it. There are some who are. I don't think that Blinken is one of them, but he is certainly not someone whose overall approach is to put diplomacy above war. He's not an ideologue for diplomacy, if you will. So, there's going to be some serious questioning here. I think one personnel matter, which was not a question of the cabinet, but is also an important indication, also having to do with the Iran nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA, was the appointment of Robert Malley as the Iran envoy. This is not a position that requires a Senate approval, so it didn't come to the Senate, but it still required spending a certain amount of political capital. And it was very unclear for a week or so whether, after the announcement had been made that Biden wanted to appoint Rob Malley, who had been the head for many years of the International Crisis Group, earlier had been in both the Obama National Security Council and that of Bill Clinton, working on Middle East issues, but very much known as a diplomat's diplomat, meaning somebody who understands that diplomacy means give and take, not only take, and not only threaten war. So the appointment of Rob Malley was very much a question whether Biden would be willing to spend the political capital. Ultimately, he was, and I think that was perhaps the most significant single sign that we got about his commitment to the nuclear deal. Now, it doesn't mean that Rob Malley has a free hand. He's still accountable to Biden's agenda, not his own. So how much he's going to be able to accomplish is still unclear. But there is some good news, I think, coming out of the talks in Vienna. And I think there's room for a little bit of optimism around that. And I think that that kind of appointment, even below the cabinet level, can be a good indication of what might be possible.
Excellent. And let's stick with you for a minute, Phyllis, here. Let's just go straight into the JCPOA. There was a letter written, I think it was 70 reps signed it, urging Biden not to re-enter the JCPOA without getting additional whatever from Iran. So how effective do you think that was? And do you think, why hasn't Biden just re-entered the deal?
Well, it's, the question is, re-entering the deal is not just a statement. It means a commitment to do certain things. The problem that Biden faces is twofold. Assuming that he wants to seriously engage and he wants to re-enter the deal, and he understands that any future deal with Iran on regional issues, on other issues, and Iran, of course, has other issues they want to raise with the US, has to start with going back to the nuclear deal on its own terms. I think that Biden understands that. You never know for sure what he understands and doesn't, but I think he understands that. And I know that Rob Malley understands that. So if he has access to him, he'll explain that. I think the problem that Biden faces is that the 70 members of Congress who signed on to that letter was not a surprise. This happened as well under Obama at the time that the deal was first being negotiated. The White House was actively supporting it, was actively fighting for it. Congress was split down the middle. The Democrats were split between the warmongers who said the only way to deal with Iran is to threaten war, impose crippling sanctions, and force them to do our bidding, and those who said that maybe somehow we should give diplomacy some kind of a chance. There was not a lot of enthusiasm for the deal. There was a lot of enthusiasm at the level of popular mobilization. And this is where movement activism, again, played a huge role in making it possible for Obama to sign on to the deal. That's one problem that Biden faces. The other problem is that Trump didn't just walk away from the deal. He made the entire relationship between the United States and Iran far more toxic, far more dangerous, and the treatment of the people of Iran far worse than it had been under the deal. So it was not only that Trump reimposed the sanctions that Obama had lifted, the so-called nuclear sanctions, those that were linked directly to Iran's nuclear power program, which the US at times liked to claim had something to do with a nuclear weapon, even though all the US intelligence agencies all agreed, all 16 of them, and they still agree to this, they still haven't changed their position, acknowledging that Iran has never had a nuclear weapon, never built a nuclear weapon, never bought a nuclear weapon, and they agreed that Iran has never even decided whether or not it even wants a nuclear weapon. Iran says they don't want it. The US position is we don't know whether they want it or not, but there's certainly no evidence that they do, and they've never tried to build one, et cetera. So there were a set of sanctions that had to do with the nuclear policies of Iran that were lifted when the Iran nuclear deal was signed. Trump not only leaves the deal, goes back and reimposes those sanctions, but went on to impose almost 1,500 new sanctions in the last year since he walked out of the deal in 2018, that were far more ruthless, far more crippling to the Iranian economy, so that when the pandemic hit, Iran was one of the worst hit countries in the world. And it still is having a terrible time dealing with the pandemic crisis, because it suddenly lost its ability to buy critical manufacturing equipment and drugs and the seed stock to make certain drugs. Iran had quite an advanced healthcare system, but it's now in shambles because it can't get the parts it needs, it can't get the chemicals that it needs to create its own vaccines and its own medications. And for the first time in modern Iranian history, we have children, not very many, thankfully, yet, but some children dying of malnutrition. That has never happened in the history of modern Iran. And now, under these sanctions, it's starting. So what Biden faces is he not only has to go back into the deal technically, take away those deal-based sanctions, he also has to lift this whole set of new sanctions, which were designed precisely to make that difficult. Trump designed sanctions whose goal was to make it impossible for his successor to go back into the nuclear deal. So it's not simply a matter of just proclaim it. Oh, okay, we're done, sanctions are over. He can't do that. They're bound up with international financial transactions. They're bound up with banks and corporations. They're bound up, for example, one of the things we always hear is, well, that shouldn't be a problem. You know, the sanctions rules always have an exception written in for food and medicine. They're not covered by the sanctions. Right. In most cases, technically, that's true. And in all cases, technically, it doesn't matter, because what it means is the sanctions punish not only Iran and the people of Iran and companies in Iran, but it punishes any company anywhere in the world, in any country, that has the temerity to say, for example, we're going to sell X to Iran. Now, in theory, if X is a medicine or a food item, it's okay, it's not illegal. But that doesn't mean you can just do it. It means you have to hire a raft of lawyers who know how to navigate their way through the permit system that can take a year and cost an inordinate amount of money. And so a country is dealing with their own laws, and then a company in that country is saying, you know what, we can't afford it. It's just not worth it to us to take the risk of sending medical aid to, selling even medical supplies to Iran, because we don't have the capacity to fight back against the US claiming that we're in violation of the sanctions. So that's what Biden is facing right now.
Right, yeah, that's a much more complicated view of it than I think most people have. And that's super interesting. We'll come back to you on sanctions here in a little bit, but we have a end the sanctions and blockade and sanctions campaign going on. And we've talked a lot about how Biden needs to issue some sort of waiver to allow, to be very explicit that you can allow food and medical supplies in during COVID at the very, very least.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's great. We're going to switch over to Jeff here for a moment. One thing that Phyllis mentioned was that Biden's, primary goal, his primary focus has been COVID-19 and responding to the pandemic. The American Rescue Plan being a part of that. What are your thoughts on how he's responded? How's it going? Where could he be doing better?
Well, the American Rescue Plan, the COVID rescue plan, has been the biggest success. It passed because of budget reconciliation with no Republican votes. But what got stripped out of it with the help of corporate Democrats, and people complained Biden didn't fight for it. What got stripped out of it was the $15 minimum wage, the federal minimum wage. That matters. Now, to make up for it, Biden has issued an executive order mandating a $15 minimum wage for all federal contracts. That's a good thing. That's going to affect about 400,000 workers. But the Fight for 15 campaign that Roots Action's a part of, and No Honeymoon, it's one of our 6 planks. If we had got a $15 federal minimum wage, that would have raised the wages of 30 million workers, not 400,000. And when you raise the floor for 30 million workers at the bottom, it has an upward pressure on wages for the whole working class. So it's still something we've got to fight for and keep fighting for.
Yeah.
Can I just add one point on the pandemic response? I think Jeff is absolutely right that is so far the biggest success, but it has a major defect, which is on the international side. The US is still the wealthiest country in the history of the world and the wealthiest country today. And the notion that people are dying in the streets of New Delhi and across India because of the lack of oxygen canisters. Yeah. We're not even talking here about the vaccine challenge. We're not even talking about the medicine challenge. We're talking about the lack of oxygen. And you know that those giant US military hospitals in Germany, for instance, are filled with things like plenty of oxygen canisters that could be loaded up onto a transport plane and just flown off to India in a minute. Biden has not made the initial decisions to make that happen. And that needs to be part of our understanding of what success in dealing with the pandemic really requires. It means responding on a global level as well as within our own country.
And piggybacking on that, I think it's important when the Biden team was seeming to say, when asked, are you going to share the vaccines? And they seemed to be hoarding the vaccine. And then there was outrage among progressives, among some journalists. And then Team Biden sort of backtracked a little bit and said, of course, we're going to be forthcoming and help the rest of the world. I mean, there's a problem in our society that there's that ethnocentrism. You know, we are 4% of the global population. And we got to start thinking about ourselves as global citizens.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally agree. Going back to you, Phyllis, let's move into talking about those sanctions and how that plays into COVID specifically. But then one thing David Gordon brings up in the chat, and usually we save questions for the end, but this is important because we've been emailing about it too, is the obstruction of allowing generic pharmaceutical companies around the world to start producing the vaccines, the patent laws. In the United States and Western Europe, rich countries are not supporting that. So I guess what are your thoughts on how Biden has done involving sanctions and how that relates to COVID, as well as allowing the generic drugs to be produced so that India can get what they need?
India is the largest producer of generic drugs in the world and has been for a long time, not only for its own enormous population of 1.3 billion, but making those drugs available across the global south at prices that are far more affordable than anything the US is willing to sell. So there's a huge problem with this issue of intellectual property. And there's a global mobilization underway to change the rules within the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to essentially say that on behalf of the people of the world, we are in a pandemic crisis and your patents just don't apply anymore. So we're taking your drugs, whatever it takes, we're just going to do it. It's not clear how that could happen. It's not clear what Biden would have to do. One possibility that's been raised is there's plenty of money, as we know now. No longer can they claim that we don't have the money for X, Y, or Z. There is plenty of money. The question is where it gets spent. Cutting the military budget in half, cutting $350 billion out of the military budget would be a very good start. And some of that money could be used, if necessary, to buy off those drug companies that are refusing to make the patents available. I don't think that any president in this country is prepared to simply take the patents as a, using force if necessary. I think that that's a legitimate consideration when the lives of literally millions of people have already been lost and millions more are at immediate and direct risk. But that's not something that's going to happen. So the question is, what might happen? There might be something that could involve paying off the companies. Ironically, it was primarily not private money. This is always the claim that we have to protect the intellectual property rights because that's what fuels these great inventions. Well, in this case, that was not what was going on. These great inventions were fueled almost entirely by public money that was given to these countries who claimed we can do it fast. And it turned out, yes, they could. They were very smart. They had great scientists. They got a ton of money and they produced the recipe to make this stuff. It should belong to all of us. And that should be the basis for it. Now, that's a different issue to some degree than the sanctions, although the impact obviously is very much the same. And the problem is that sanctions is dealt with by the Biden administration like it was by the Trump administration, by the Obama administration, by the Bush administration, and back ad infinitum as an alternative to war. It's sold as an alternative to war, and it's not. It's a weapon of war. It's a different kind of weapon that does something different. It doesn't shoot people or blow people up, but it kills people the same way. The goal of a military, the job of a military, is to kill people and break things. Sanctions do exactly the same thing. They kill people and break things. Sometimes more slowly, sometimes not so much slower. When you blow up water treatment plants and you deny people access to water, people die pretty quickly. So this is the challenge for us as political movements, as activists, is to change how people understand what sanctions are about. And I'm not even talking about sort of the individual sanctions imposed on a particular warlord somewhere. It can often be a mistake because sometimes they're the ones you need to negotiate with. And if you've prohibited them from traveling, you're going to make it hard to negotiate. But that's not what kills large numbers of people. What kills large numbers of people are these economic sanctions, broad-based sanctions that are imposed directly on the theory that it will make people rise up against their government, against their dictator. It has never, ever worked. There's no example that people can point to in history where that kind of sanctions imposed from the outside against the will of a population led to them challenging their own government as opposed to rallying around their own government to challenge the guys who imposed the sanctions on them. Because what a surprise, people are not stupid. And it turns out that that lack of being stupid means that sanctions as a strategy for externally imposed regime change simply doesn't work.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've been speaking with a lot of people recently who are either in or work on behalf of countries with sanctions right now. And one thing I've heard over and over is the idea that starving to death is sometimes more violent than a bomb. It's because it's just so awful and it's torture essentially.
We should also recognize that it's illegal in the same way that going to war against another country is a violation of the UN Charter. Imposing sanctions is dealt with in exactly the same area in the UN Charter, my sort of coming apart version of it here that I carry around with me. Sanctions are part of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is the chapter that deals with action in respect to threats to the peace and breaches of the peace. It's not part of Chapter 6, which is called the Pacific Settlement, the peaceful settlement of disputes. That's not where sanctions are because sanctions are not peaceful. Right. Sanctions are part of Chapter 7, which is the military, the violent responses to threats to the international peace. That's where you put sanctions. And just like going to war, imposing sanctions is something that has to be done by the United Nations, cannot be done legally by one country against another.
Yeah, that's a law that the United States loves to ignore. We use
and violate directly. Exactly.
Violate constantly. It's awful. Jeff, going back to you, let's stick with COVID for a minute. I just got my second shot and the experience was so easy. You're in, you're out, no insurance card needed. it was almost like a sample of real Medicare for all or universal healthcare. It was like it was a taste of it. How's Biden done on healthcare? Has he done anything at all? And are you hopeful at all that this, at least this, these COVID vaccines give a pathway maybe for more support for Medicare for all?
Well, the public supports Medicare for all more now than ever.
Right.
It's probably the worst issue that Biden had when he was campaigning for president. He went so far in one interview as to say if somehow Medicare for all passed both houses of Congress, he might consider vetoing it, perhaps the stupidest thing he said the whole time on the campaign trail. So he's not great on healthcare. We really have an opportunity, as you say, Ryan. The public has seen how important public health is. It's not a tough argument to make today that that stuff should be free and it's good for the whole society. In last night's speech, he did a good job. He said one good thing, let's see if it'll ever happen, which is he's going to have he's proposing that Medicare negotiate with big pharma and negotiate the prices of drugs downward. Later last night, I saw Bernie Sanders with Colbert, and Bernie was real big on that. But again, right now it's just talk. So I would say that universal health care, something we activists have fought for years, it's pretty bad. It's a failure of the Biden administration so far. Remember, during the campaign, he talked about reducing the age of qualifying for Medicare from 65 to 60. There's been no talk of that. Even Hillary Clinton at the end of her campaign in 2016 was saying she was going to reduce the age to qualify for Medicare to 55. But we've made none of those steps toward Medicare for all that we should be making.
Yeah, completely agree. It's been bizarre that the president who came after, who helped build the ACA, hasn't hopped on that again to, go back to the well, what worked.
Right. And I think Phyllis had brought up the important issue of military spending on all of these expansive domestic agendas. The money is in the military.
Right.
And when we look at successes and failures of Team Biden, one of the failures is they have not cut a penny from the military budget.
Well,
And
quite the contrary. If I can just interrupt you for 1 second, Jeff.
Yeah, it's
not
gone
only
up in it. Yeah.
They've raised it $13 billion. And that is more than the entire budget of the CDC. My colleagues at IPS at the National Priorities Project just did the number crunching on this. That $13 billion is about $5 billion more than the entire budget of the CDC. At this moment of this pandemic, we know what keeps us safe. It's not $13 billion more to the military. It's the CDC.
Or it's not modernizing nuclear weapons. Like, who gives a damn? So, I mean, Phyllis is completely right. And I think it's important when we look at successes and failures, how do they budget? The budget is a moral document. And before we went live here, Phyllis and I and others were mentioning the parallels to President Lyndon Johnson in the 60s, who did great things in the 2 civil rights bills, the Great Society. Medicare was started under LBJ. And the war in Vietnam, he just kept expanding it and expanding it. And you can't have guns and butter. You couldn't have it in the 1960s. You can't have it now. We are the only advanced industrial country that does not have universal health care, that does not have free or inexpensive higher education. And the big difference between us and Scandinavia, Germany, France, Holland, you name it, the big difference is we spend all this money on the military and they don't. I mean, that's one of the biggest differences between our society and other advanced societies is the military budget. And it's almost off limits. You will never hear it mentioned on MSNBC. You will not hear it on CNN, NPR, but it's something that progressives need to keep raising over and over and over.
Just right now, yesterday, I guess, or maybe today, the numbers came out of what's known as SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research. That's one of the leading sources in the world for the right number crunching on the cost of military spending around the world. And the US has gone from what it has been the last couple of years, where the US military budget is bigger than the next 10 countries. It's now bigger than the next 11 countries. We've gone up. And this is at a time of the global economy has shrunk, but military spending is 2% higher globally. And the countries where military spending went down, one of them, for example, is South Korea, which was one of the countries that did the best in the pandemic. They responded quickly. They got people vaccinated as soon as the vaccines were available. They've sort of done all the right stuff. And they're one of the few countries that cut back on their military spending in the context of this pandemic. The US now is raising military spending in the context of the pandemic. So it's one of these shocking, not surprising, but shocking realities. If we cut $350 billion, it's less than half. But if we cut that out of the military budget, we would be well on our way to being able to at least begin to pay for the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, free college education, a couple $100 billion each for those programs would be enough to start it on its way in each one.
You're here.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that brings up what Biden brought up last night, and we haven't had a ton of time to study this and roundtable this or anything. But Jeff, what are your thoughts on the American Families Plan that he unveiled last night? I mean, on one hand, 4 more years of school, 2 pre-K and 2 like community college, but no canceling student debt, no overall free college. What are your thoughts on that? It's a $1.8 trillion plan, which sounds big, and there's some good stuff in there. What do you think?
Yeah, there's great stuff in there, including increased Pell Grants, expanded childcare, paid family leave. It goes beyond education. There's really good things in there, but it's just the plan right now. One of the great things in there is it calls for paying for it all by raising taxes on corporations and wealthy individuals. That's hugely popular. When pollsters like from Marist, mainstream pollsters, were first asking people about Biden's infrastructure plan, which is beyond infrastructure. That's called the American Jobs Plan. When they would explain in their poll taking to the American public that this will be paid for by increasing taxes on big corporations and the wealthy, the public support for these proposals goes up. And one of the things in the American Family Plan is to increase the IRS budget by $80 billion over 10 years so they can start auditing rich people again. Because right now you're more like they audit working class people at a higher rate than they audit rich people. Oh, and Chuck Collins, who's a colleague of Phyllis, he's written about this over and over and over, that, you know, if you had an IRS with good tax laws, you could be bringing in so much money, and you dovetail that with cutting the military budget, we could be this Green New Deal, Medicare for all society that we all dream of. But Chuck Collins, he's always talking about how taxes have become optional for the super rich. You're 4 times more likely to be audited if you use the earned income tax credit, in other words, hardcore working class, than many billionaires. And the way he summarizes what's going on is you have billionaires paying millions of dollars to their tax attorneys, their lobbyists, their wealth managers to save them and hurt the public budget trillions of dollars. That's the problem we have. But I want to say that every time Biden proposes something good, it's never enough. It's never what the public would support even stronger than his halfway measures. And a good example is just the tax rate. He wants to take the top tax bracket from, 37% because of what Trump did, to bring it back to 39.5, which is what it was for before Trump. Well, I mean, Bernie talked about 50%, AOC talked about 70%. What people need to realize, and I remember it because I'm old enough, you know, I lived in Detroit, Michigan when the middle class was booming, when Black working class people could send their kids to college. College was cheap in the 1950s. The economy was booming. The gap between the rich and poor was actually shrinking in the 1950s. And what was the tax rate under Republican President Dwight Eisenhower? The top marginal tax rate was over 90%. So again, you have Biden's going to put the tax bracket for the super rich who are richer than ever, just back to where it was pre-Trump. To me, that's not good enough. It's a step in the right direction, but the public's got to demand greater taxation on the rich and these big profitable corporations that don't pay any taxes.
This is exactly why we need strong movements. The president, whoever it is, whether it's Biden, whoever it is never going to lead on what changes really need to happen in this country, whether it's systemic racism, whether it's income inequality, whether it's climate destruction, whether it's, you know, US military intervention around the world. Presidents are never going to lead. Congress institutionally is not going to lead. There are members of Congress now who are leading, who are among the leaders. But most of all, more than our champions in Congress, we need movements that are consistent and powerful in demanding this stuff. That's what changes it. My colleague at IPS, Basav Sen, who works on our climate project, was saying today that when he was listening to the speech and sort of looking at Biden's climate policy overall, he said, you know, Biden is light years ahead of any of his predecessors. And then he paused and he said, and he's light years away from where we need to be. And that those two things are both real, and we have to hold them both and recognize it's great that he's better than any of his predecessors, whether it's on climate or on income inequality, whatever it is. And it's not good enough. It's not close to good enough. So we have to balance both of those two things.
And I would argue that he's better than previous presidents, largely because the organized progressive movement is bigger than it was 12 years ago when Obama came in, better organized, better funded, and more astute about the need to always accelerate your activism when Democrats have the Congress, when Democrats are in the White House. That's not when you go to sleep. That's when you accelerate your activism. And so I look at the strength of the progressive community, which was pressuring Biden. I mean, he was lucky to get through Bernie Sanders. He knows it. And progressives need to, and this is why I praise all the activists on this call who've been part of our No Honeymoon campaign, because you guys have kept the pressure on Biden, Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, and all the people that need pressure. They
know that Biden was elected by Black women, mainly in the South. That's what pushed him over the edge. And they've got to recognize that.
And in Arizona by young Latinos. And, you know,
and
I mean,
Native
they won
folks.
these narrow victories. And it was not because they won over, quote, moderate Republicans. You know, Republicans were sticking with Trump. It was new voters, young voters, people of color voters.
Yeah, completely agree with all of that. And, you know, Jeff, to one of your earlier points, I think that IRS money will pay for itself, right? You know, the money they invest in the IRS, they'll get it back 10, you know, hand over fist, you know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, $80 billion for IRS auditors over 10 years will bring in hundreds of billions of dollars and bring it in from the people that can afford to pay it.
That's right. That's right. So we're running short on time, and I still have so many issues I want to get to. Speaking of saving money, which is very important when we have actual important things to pay for, Phyllis, we're ending the war in Afghanistan. Did you hear the great news? It's over. It's completely done. We're not spending any more money there. What's going on? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's complicated. What a surprise. It's very good that Biden announced the end of the war in Afghanistan, that he's pulling all the troops out. That's very good. The troops shouldn't be there. They should be pulled out. However, there are at least two big problems. There's a small problem about the date. He's simply putting aside the agreement that the US had made. Yes, it was made under the Trump regime, but nonetheless, it was a US position that the troops would be pulled out by May 1st. And he said, no, we'll start on May 1st and then we'll finish by September 11th, nicely making the link, reminding people that in his view, the war was legitimate. This was supposed to be the good war. But there's two bigger problems than that. The first is we don't really know what we're talking about when Biden says we're going to withdraw, quote, the troops. There's between 2,500 and 3,500 US ground troops in Afghanistan now. That's a very small number. Most of them are doing training of various sorts, backing up the Afghan military. Pulling them out is a good thing. They're there for no good reason. They're, it makes sense for them to be pulled out. But besides them, there's about another 1,000 special operations forces. Are they going to be pulled out as well?
Right.
They, among other things, have been conducting throughout the years, they have conducted assassinations, kidnappings, etc. There are 18,000 military contractors, better known as mercenaries, that are in Afghanistan, mostly working to support the Afghan military as well, including maintaining the Afghan Air Force. Are they going to be pulled out? Or are their contracts going to be rewritten so they can stay, but it won't be officially paid by the Pentagon? It'll be paid by somebody else who will then be paid by the Pentagon anyway. And then we have so we have this big question, whether they're going to be pulled out at all. Then we have a second challenge, which is that the majority of civilians in Afghanistan that are being killed by the United States, and there is a large number. In 2019, it was more civilians were killed by US forces and US backed forces than were killed by the Taliban. But those forces are overwhelmingly not killed by these ground troops, this small number of ground troops. They're killed by airstrikes. They're killed by planes dropping bombs and sending missiles, and they're killed by drone strikes that go after so-called terrorists on a kill list, and too often end up killing not only the so-called terrorists, sometimes not even them, and we can talk later about who's on a so-called terrorist list in the first place, but they end up killing people in wedding parties and funeral processions and children playing in their own villages. That is not being talked about ending. We're being told that this has nothing to do with the war against terror that the US, of course, will continue to wage in Afghanistan. So that means we will officially not be going after the Taliban anymore. We'll be going after supposedly ISIS or Al-Qaeda or somebody else. And it means that we are still killing Afghans. That's the critical question here. Are we ending this war, or are we just pulling out a certain number of ground troops and proceeding as if nothing else has changed? Until that is dealt with, until we can put on enough pressure to say this is not good enough, this is not ending the so-called forever war, all we will be doing is changing the nature of how people in the forever war are forever being killed.
Completely agree. And I think, it's strategic when the Biden administration leaves out those details and doesn't provide those answers. I think that makes it clear. Steve in the chat says that Scahill told Amy Goodman the shift will be towards underground intelligence work and covert operations. So
that's already going on. And that's one of the questions. When there are CIA and other secret agents already working in Afghanistan, will they be staying there? Under whose authority? Will they be transferring authority from the military to the embassy staff? Every embassy, including those in war zones like Afghanistan, of course, have a small number of usually Marines to protect the diplomats. That's not considered a war activity. Yeah. Will the CIA killers be under their jurisdiction? We have no idea. We just don't know.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Lots going on. If people watching, if you have questions, please add them to the chat. I've been trying to keep up with them and make sure I'm asking them as we're live. Conversation has definitely run long, but it's been a good one. Still have a couple quick things I want to touch on. If Jeff, quickly, I think we would be mistaken to not bring up George Floyd and racial justice, police reform, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. There's some good stuff in there. Personally, I don't think it goes nearly far enough, But for a Joe Biden administration, it's like, okay, that's pretty good. What are your thoughts there?
Well, last night in his speech, Biden supported the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but it's as he was speaking, the thing's being weakened.
Right.
You know, they're negotiating with the senator from South Carolina, the Republican, and it's being weakened, and it may not have teeth. That's a problem. The one good thing in the racial justice and criminal justice area is that Biden ended by executive order the federal death penalty. President Trump had gone on a killing spree in the last 6 months. Federal killing spree, executing federal prisoners. So that stopped. That's a good thing. Just like Obama had, Biden has announced that the DOJ, Department of Justice, will no longer continue with contracts with private for-profit prisons. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
But just like Obama, Biden is not issuing an executive order for the Department of Homeland Security to phase out the ICE detention facilities, which are private for profit. It is insidious to make profit off of incarcerating or detaining people. It's not good. Right. And so again, everything in every area, whether it's the jobs plan not going far enough toward the Green New Deal, whether it's the racial justice and criminal justice, they never go far enough. And that's why it's so important that Roots Action activists and others and our allies just keep pushing on every single one of these issues.
I agree completely. And Phyllis has mentioned several times this evening, movements. We got to have the movements. We got to have the work on the ground, the constant pressure. Phyllis, back to you. 2 topics we haven't gotten to yet, Yemen and Israel-Palestine. I know you've written books about Israel-Palestine, so I would regret if I don't ask you your thoughts on that. And how has Biden done there? It's such a big subject. I can't really hone in on anything.
The brief version is that Biden has made clear, as I said right at the beginning, his priorities on foreign policy are the pivot to China, the tensions ratcheting up with China, and the Iran nuclear deal. Now, the Iran deal is shaping a great deal of US policy in the region as a whole, in the Middle East and in the broader MENA, Middle East, North Africa region, West Asia, South Asia, all of that. What that means is Biden seems to be prepared to put a little bit of pressure on Israel by going back into the nuclear deal. Israel is dead set against it. Netanyahu sees this as the way he stays out of prison. He's facing potential serious prison terms when he's no longer prime minister. And he's now going into potentially a 5th election in 2 years because the Israeli parliament, the Israeli voting blocs are just divided, not between left and right. It's far right. It's the right, the center right, the far right, and the fascist right now that have now been allowed into the parliament. And the divide is including Netanyahu or without Netanyahu. That's the big difference. And for Netanyahu, his only real credential is he's the only one that can prevent the United States from doing this terrible thing, which is going back to the Iran nuclear deal. The Biden administration, which is very, very committed to Israel, Biden personally is, Secretary of State Blinken is personally very committed to Israel. That was known about him from before. It's true of Biden as well. They do not want to hear about anything, for example, the new bill proposed by Congresswoman Betty McCollum, House Resolution 2590, which has just been introduced this week. It's a very important bill that basically is designed to, it doesn't cut US military aid, but it imposes some end use restrictions so that that aid cannot be used for the incarceration and detention of children, which is common in Israel, by the Israelis in the occupied territories against Palestinian children only. And it cannot be used for the destruction of families' homes, which has also been very common. So that's a huge step forward. It's a reflection of this major shift in discourse, which is now underway. We're seeing that with the release in the last 2 months, one of them just in the last 2 days, of major new human rights reports, one by the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem that was released at the end of January, and the other by Human Rights Watch 2 days ago that make the determination that Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid. It's a huge step. It's not because it's new and different, oh my God, it's apartheid. This has long been known. It's long been asserted by Palestinians, by the Palestinian Rights movement, by South Africans from civil society right up through top government officials. But it has never been acknowledged by US elites, by US government officials, or by Human Rights Watch. So this is a huge shift that very much reflects what the Palestinian rights movement, led by Palestinians themselves, has managed to do in changing that level of understanding, that level of discourse, in reflecting how people now view US military support for Israel. The $3.8 billion a year that we give to Israel is now something that is completely a partisan issue. The polls show it. I won't go into all the details of the polls, but it's now these massive differences where it's 60 some odd percent of Republicans are very positive towards Israel and 20 some odd percent of Democrats. If you look at young Democrats, if you look at Democrats of color, if you look in the Jewish community, these transitions, these transformations are even more shocking and huge. So we're at a pivotal moment. And when you see these new reports coming out, you see this new resolution now pending in Congress with over 20 co-sponsors, this is an indication of how that's changed. None of that comes from the Biden administration. Biden made clear that he does not support the really extremist moves that Trump had made, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, recognizing the right of Israel to annex huge swaths of territory, and crucially, acknowledging and accepting the nation state law that Israel passed in the equivalent of what would here be a constitutional amendment. It's that important to law that says explicitly that only Jews have the right of self-determination in the land of Israel. No one else. Only Hebrew is an official language now of the state of Israel. So that was a real shift in US policy, much farther to the right. Biden made clear he did not agree with that and simultaneously made clear he would not reverse it. So he's not going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. He's not going to deny that the annexation of more land is illegal. So we have a lot of work ahead, but we're doing it in an incredibly important, transformed environment where the public discourse and the media discourse, increasingly, it's not what it needs to be. But if you compare it to what it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it's night and day.
Yeah.
So this is an incredible moment for that, not because of the Biden administration, but because of our movements.
Yeah, completely agreed. Yeah, like you said there at the end, it's
You're
because of the pressure that we've maintained for years. It is 9 o'clock now. We are super late. I have 2 quick questions for you, Jeff, and then we'll move on to our action. First one, if you can do 30-second answer. The ERA, why haven't we passed the ERA yet?
That's a good question. Am I right that there's discussion about just one more state and then it'll go to the courts about whether the old ratifying states can go with the new ratifying states? I love the ERA. It's a winning issue for the left. I think we should be picking it up. It's a winner, and I don't care if we have to start from scratch. It's a real winning issue. I mean, the younger generation in our country, they're the most anti-racist age demographic in our society, the most anti-sexist, the most anti-homophobic, and so I would love to see that issue. We can win that culture war.
Yeah, and hopefully Biden pushes for it, does something. It's almost like he's using COVID as an excuse to do very, very little. And I know COVID takes a lot of attention, but it's a lot of waiting for things like that to have some action taken. Even just use the bully pulpit, build some power amongst people. Second question, the For the People Act. Do you think this has a chance of passing? I believe that is the one to save democracy and to try to help get money out of politics. Thoughts on that?
I don't know how you could use budget reconciliation to get that passed.
Yeah.
Like you can these other things. I think some of these other things are really live because they do dramatically affect the budget. And all you need is the 50 Democrats on board, as bad as Manchin and Sinema and some of the others are. But the pro-democracy, is that HR 1?
Yeah.
I don't know. It seems like a long shot to me. I mean, to me, we set up vote Trump out, then challenge Biden and the no honeymoon campaign with the understanding that if Biden didn't go big, if Biden didn't deliver for working class people and people of color, the Republicans are going to come storming back in 2022.
Yep.
We were trying to save Biden from himself. And we didn't want a repeat of what happened under President Clinton in 94 or Barack Obama in 2010. So again, some of these things are going to require the Democrats actually expanding majority in the House and gaining a majority in the Senate. And that's only going to come if some of this stuff passes and people's lives are materially improved.
Right. And I just would point out, the Democrats, technically have a majority, but you don't have a majority when you have Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin as part of your party. It's not a real majority. It's a fake majority. Last question, and then we have to do our action. I'm sorry, everybody. From Mary Ann. For both of you, Jeff and Phyllis, very quickly, can you name something concrete that Joe Biden has delivered so far for U.S. citizens? What do you think the top thing he has actually delivered so far is, if anything?
I think
Jeff?
it's the American Rescue Plan.
Yeah.
I mean, that put money in people's pockets. It extended unemployment. There were other social safety net expansions. That's the big win so far.
Yeah.
I think the other two are the other big bills that are out there. We don't know if they're going to win or not, but also the COVID vaccine access.
Yeah.
Once it got underway, it's been enormously successful. The failure has been at the international level, but in terms of people in this country, it's done really well.
I agree. Phyllis, is there any foreign policy wins for progressives?
I would say it's a win that Biden felt that he could, for other reasons, not because of our movements, but our movements made it politically possible, politically viable for him to announce the pullout from Afghanistan. It's not sufficient. It's not what we need, but it's better that those ground troops be pulled out and that we fight over the next phase of pullouts than not having that happen. So that's, I would say, a significant victory. Going back into the WHO and the United Nations was a victory. Going back to the Paris Climate Agreement was a victory. Although, as I said earlier, it's light years better than what his predecessors were and light years away from where he needs to be on climate. So none of these are complete successes, but they are important steps that we've not had in the past, and they're made possible by our movements.
Hear, hear.
Excellent. There is one more question for you in the chat, Phyllis, about how you think the best tactic for us at this moment as movements. You can answer it now, or you can feel free to chat it's up to you.
There's so many. I'm not going to choose tactics. Organizations choose their own tactics, but I think that the intersection question is key. Every time we talk about the need for a Green New Deal, the question comes back, well, that all sounds good, but where are you going to get the money? How are you going to pay for it? The answer has to be not only raising taxes on the richest and on the corporations and cutting the military budget. We can't separate those. That has to be there every step of the way. And until all of our movements that are focused primarily on the anti-racist struggle, on climate justice, on ending poverty, on women's rights, on trans rights and anti-homophobia, all of those movements, the immigrant rights movement, the labor movement, all those of us who work in the peace movement side of things, the anti-militarism side, we have to get into the hands of the activists in those movements the information that will make it possible for them to include ending wars as a component of that. That has to be part of it. It's about how we protect people in this country and how we protect people around the world. We need the money back home so that we can have a Green New Deal, and we need to stop spending it on the military so that we stop killing people.
100% agree. Very well said. And now we're going to move into our action where we will try to get some of that money back, especially from the military. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Phyllis, so much. Feel free to stick around and chat with people or log off because it is late. I understand. For everyone following along, I am adding to the chat. Oops, wrong keyboard. Adding to the chat now. I just did it twice in a row, but there are the links for tonight's action. I'm going to share my screen now. So we can see what we're doing today. So April 29th, Biden's first 100 days. You know, I didn't want to just choose one email action because I think the important part is what Phyllis was just saying there. People saying, how are we going to pay for it for all these things that we definitely need? And we got to pass something. We got to have some wins if we're going to do anything in 2022, if Democrats have a chance. So what we're doing is, besides the phone call, which I will get to, I put 3 actions in that are all super easy to take. The first one, support cutting the military spending by at least 10%. The second one, tax what the top fraction of 1% inherit.